Hello, in this video, I'm going to be walking you through how you can dub multiple videos automatically and automate the process in MKIO. So in the previous video, I spoke to you about how you could dub individual videos into multiple language of your choice. This is a very manual process. So you take the videos, you choose the language, create the jobs, and then run them for each asset that you wanted to do this for. This is great for individual videos, allowing you to have control and test the feature. But let's say you have hundreds of videos and hundreds of assets that you want to be dubbed, then you're going to need a more automated process. So that's what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to build a few things. One of those is a automation script. So this is going to take temporary assets and then submit dubbing jobs on those assets. We're also going to build a webhook listener. So this will listen for when the dubbing jobs are finished, and when they are, we can then insert the audio tracks into our encoded assets. Before we get started, you're going to need some encoded videos. These are going to be the videos that you run your dubbing job on. They need to be in separate assets. For this example, I'm going to use 3 English assets just for simplicity, but obviously this process can scale upwards to as many assets as you have. You need to make sure that your assets are in the correct MP4 format. So for the VOD dubbing, this requires the newest MP4 V4 format. There's a guide in the description that will let you identify and help you identify what format they are in. But a quick overview would be to look for seeing if it has a .mpd manifest. This is a pretty good clue that it is in the new format. So I'm going to be writing this script in Python, and the first step to do is to install our packages. So in the terminal, in the project that we're going to be working in, I'm going to do pip install requests flask and python.env. The next step is to install ngrok. Because this is going to be running locally on our system, the webhooks need to call a publicly reachable HTTPS URL. And localhost isn't accessible from MKIO servers. So ngrok will create a temporary tunnel to your localhost server so that MKIO can send a post request to your system. In production, you can replace ngrok with a real endpoint, a real HTTPS endpoint, and keep the same webhook flow. So to install ngrok, we're going to do brew install ngrok. I'm on macOS. If you're on Windows or Linux, there'll be different commands to run. You can find this in the description. And then the next step is to create our environment file. This is going to store the API keys for connecting to MKIO, and also our storage account name and a few other variables that we want to keep consistent. So the first thing I'm going to add is the API token. You can get this in MKIO if you go onto your application name and then view API tokens. We're also going to add our project name. So MKIO project name. We're going to add our storage account name and then our webhook secret. For the webhook secret, this is just any random string that you choose. I'd recommend setting this in the terminal. So you can generate this in the terminal using SSH keygen. So now before we create the scripts, we can create our transforms within MKIO itself. So we can use the UI for this. We can do this using the API, but since it's only something we need to do once, we can just do it within the UI. The process is pretty simple. You can just go into MKIO, click on video processing, create transform, and then create your dubbing transform. And then for your track insertion transforms, you had to do this via the API, but we discussed this in a previous video. Once these are complete, you're ready to start creating your first script. So the first script I'm going to make is the submit jobs Python script. This will create your assets for your dubbed audio and then submit the dubbing jobs based on the transforms that we just made. So the first thing to do is to import the required dependencies. In this case, we need OS requests to actually send the API requests, and then from .env import load.env. This is going to enable Python to read our env file. So you can find the script and both of the scripts I'm going to explain in the documentation. So you can just copy and paste them into your workflow and adjust your environment variables. But I'm just going to quickly walk through each of the parts of doing so you understand. So before any of the functions run, the script does 3 things. It will load your environment variables from an env file. So this will be your API token, your project name, and the storage account name. Then it will build the base API URL. So it points to our MKIO project's media endpoint. And then it will define the list of encoded videos that you want to dub. You can just swap these names out for your actual asset names. So this will create a new empty output asset to hold your dubbed audio results. And what this is doing is it's taking your source video name, it's appending dubbed audio to the end to create a new asset name, and then it sends a put request to the MKIO API to create that asset in your storage account. If the asset already exists, it just moves on. There's no error, there's no problem. and then it will return the new asset name, so the next step knows how to write the output. So the next function here is just finding a usable MP4 file within the encoded video asset to feed into the dubbing job. It will call the storage API to list all the files within the asset, and then it will loop through the file list and return the first MP4 that it finds. All of the MP4s in the asset contain the audio files you need for the dubbing, so it just selects the first one, because it doesn't really matter. So the next function here is submitting the actual dubbing job into MKIO, and it's using the pre-configured transform that we made earlier. So what it's doing, it's building a job name from your source asset, for example, dub video 001. It's then sending a put request to the dubbing multi-language transform endpoint. This is the transform that we set up in advance. And this defines the dubbing settings and the target languages, things like that. And then the request body is telling MKIO which asset to read from, which specific file to process, and then which asset to write the dubbed result to. So once this is submitted, MKIO is going to process the job in the background, and then it will send a webhook when it's done. So now onto our next script. This one is the webhook listener script. At the top, it's got the same pattern as before. It's loading your API token, it's loading your project name, and it's loading your webhook secret from the env file. It's again building the base API URL, and then you can see here it's creating our Flask application. So this is what turns our script into a running web server that can receive the incoming HTTP requests. So the first function here is get dubbed files. After a dubbing job finishes, this goes and fetches the resulting audio files from the asset. So what it's doing, it's calling the MKIO storage API to list all the files in the dubbed asset, and then it's looping through these files, identifying each one by its language code in the file name. So for example, if it has _ES, then it knows it's a Spanish file. It then returns a dictionary mapping language codes to the file paths. The next function is going to submit our track insertion jobs. So this submits a single track insertion job for one language. So what it's doing is it's taking the dubbed audio file for one language and then submitting it to the appropriate insertion transform. So the job is telling MKIO, take the Spanish audio file and then add it as an audio track onto your original asset. After all the 3 track insertion jobs have run, the original video asset will have multiple audio files. There'll be one per language, so then the viewer can switch between the languages they want. So our next function is the insert all tracks function. So this is orchestrating the insertion of all the audio files into our existing encoded asset for a single video. So this first calls the get dubbed files function, and then this retrieves the list of dubbed audio files. It will then define a mapping of each language code to its transform name. So Spanish to insert Spanish, French to insert French, German to insert German. And then it will loop through each language and call the submit track insertion job for each one. So you never have to call this manually, it just gets triggered automatically. And then finally, function 4 is our webhook. This will be our webhook route. So this is sort of the heart of the server. This will receive and process every incoming webhook event from MKIO. So the first thing it's doing here is a security check. So it's going to read the authorization header on the incoming request, and then it's going to compare it against your webhook secret. So if it doesn't match, it will then return 401, and it will ignore this request. So this will stop anyone else from hitting your endpoint and triggering jobs. Next, it's going to parse the payload. So it's going to pull out the key fields from the webhook JSON. So it's going to pull out the event type, job name, job state, and then it reacts based on what has arrived. So the job state is finished, and the job's name starts with dub, then it knows that a dubbing job is completed. So it automatically is going to call this insert all tracks function to kick off the next stage. If the job name starts with insert, then it knows the track insertion just finished and it logs it for you. If the state is error, it's going to return a failure. And finally here you can see it returns a 200 response no matter what. This is important because if MKIO doesn't get a 200 response back, then it will just keep retrying the webhook over and over again. And then the 5th function is just a simple health route. It's a sort of sanity check endpoint, so it just returns status OK. It's useful to check if the server's up and running before you start running jobs. And then again, you've got the main block, and this is what runs when you start the script. It just prints a startup checklist, and it reminds you to make sure that you have your transforms created. and make sure you have your webhook rule set up in the MKO dashboard. It's then going to start our Flask server on port 500, and it's going to be listening for the incoming webhooks. So these are the two functions that we need in order to start this automation of our dubbing for these assets. We now need to set up our ngrok tunnel. So I'm going to go into our terminal and I'm going to run ngrok http 5000. And then you should see a forwarding address. So it's going to look like https, a bunch of words, .ngrok, -free or .io.dev. And then it's going to have an arrow pointing to localhost. Using a API tool like Postman, we're going to make a put request to the webhook rules endpoint. You can find the exact parameters in the documentation below. What we're going to do here is we're going to provide authentication. We're going to choose the content type as application JSON. And then in the body, we're going to have a spec. So this is going to tell MKIO's webhooks where to send the webhooks to. So we're going to set enable to true, provide the URL, which is the URL from ngrok with /webhook at the end. And then authentication. So there's going to be a bearer token and it's going to be the webhook secret that you generated previously. And then for the events, we're going to do MediaKind, job started, and job finish. So these are the two events that Webhook's going to send back to our Flask server. We're now going to start the webhook listener. So we're going to run Python webhook listener.py. And here we go. We should see an output in our terminal showing what endpoint it's listening on, what the webhook endpoint is, and then reminding us to create our transforms, create the webhook rule, which we've just done, and then run submit jobs.py. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do Python submit jobs.py, and you should see an output showing the videos that are processing, the temporary assets that are being made for our dubbed audio, and then just some status monitoring as it's going along. So the webhook listener will start showing you live updates. So you'll see that the jobs are scheduled, the webhook request, whether the webhook's been received, that the job started, and hopefully when they start to finish, you get responses showing that the job's finished. You can also go to your MKO dashboard and see that the jobs appear and complete, as well as all the assets being created and being populated. Then once all our jobs are complete, we should see the following new tracks in our encoded asset. Now, from this point, you can go ahead and create your streaming locators, your streaming endpoints, and start to preview your dubbed videos.
Danach können wir diese Assets für Streaming freigeben. Los filtros te permiten controlar qué parte de tu contenido está disponible para los espectadores sin modificar el asset original. A veces, el archivo de manifiesto par défaut inclut absolument tout, toutes les pistes, toutes les qualités et l'intégralité de la timeline. Les filtres vous aident à restreindre ce qui est exposé selon votre application. Vous can show only part of a video, restrict the available bit rates presented, select specific audio languages.
Obviously, this process scales across multiple videos, but this is a pretty good starting point for you to be able to set up a process for dubbing multiple videos in MKIO. So you just submit the dubbing jobs once, and then the rest of the workflow, the track insertion, is all automated from then onwards. For the full scripts, the webhook configuration, etc., follow the documentation guides linked below. And I'll see you for the next video in the series.